Chapter 10. A Prison of Sand. I lay there for a while, my fingers running through the dusty sand beneath me. My head pounded and my heart raced. My cloudy vision refused to let me clearly see my surroundings, so exhausted, I drifted for a moment into a dreamless sleep. But only to awake to shouts and screams, pulling me out of that momentary comfort of rest, pulling me back to the harsh and frightening place I had fallen to. I slowly sat up, trying to focus my vision and look around. As my eyes adjusted, I began to make out the truly grim place I had fallen into. I was in a large dungeon, with pillars and a floor entirely covered in sand. Rising out of the sand in the center was a short flight of steps, with a large sturdy door at the top. I tried to stand. The deep sand pulled at my feet, sucking and holding onto my ankles. I fought to pull one of my feet out and take a step. It was hard going, but with a jolting, heaving movement, I managed to move forward. After several steps, I needed to rest, so I reached out to brace myself on one of the pillars. But to my horror, it crumbled into dust, the grains of sand running between my fingers. I grabbed at it again, only to pluck yet another handful of sand. A fresh belt of harrowing screams echoed around the room from somewhere above, and almost in response, a chorus of whimpers and sobs broke out from my room. Frightened, I staggered to a nearby wall to test it was solid. My fingers slid through the wall surface, producing another handful of dust. I frantically clawed at the wall in the hope of getting out, but the more I thrashed around, the more it sapped my energy and left me tired, the thick sand swamping my hands. Heaving and wrenching my feet, I tried to explore the rest of the dingy place. Sweat poured from my face, and my hands trembled in exhaustion. "Hey, stand still. It's easier if you don't move around. Sand can be very draining, you know," a whimpering voice said close by. "What is this place?" I managed to pant. "You'd be better not knowing and enjoying the last few moments, blissfully unaware," the voice said. A series of thumps and bangs cut our conversation short. The door above the steps swung open and the screams from above became increasingly louder. Fear rushed through me as I saw a massive ogre stomp down the steps and stride effortlessly across the swampy sand. The beast grabbed at something behind a pillar, wrenching a grey figure into the air like a rag doll and flopping him onto his shoulder. The man flailed around in panic, gasping for breath. The massive creature's eyes burned red as it turned around and strode back to the door, the man wriggling furtively on its shoulder. "No, don't reuse me for other things. I didn't deviate," he screamed as his cries were suddenly muffled by the door crashing shut. I fought the sucking sand and rounded a nearby column, only to find myself looking down at a wretch of a figure, half laying, half propped against a nearby wall. His dim eyes momentarily glanced at me. "I told you to stay still, save your energy for," he explained, only to tail off into a whimper. I looked him up and down, only to discover he was missing a leg, which was bandaged with fresh blood still seeping through the filthy cloth. Both of his arms were different. One was long, too long for his frame, and the other was tiny, both crudely stitched with the threads pulling at the swollen skin. I slumped down and tried to smile, but when my eyes met his, I saw that his face too was a strange mix of different shaped and sized parts. "Oh, don't mind me," he said. "I've been here a while." "What's your name?" I asked, trying not to stare at his massive left ear and right reptilian eye. "Name? We have no need for names," he said. His eyes met mine, and he smiled a little. "Wow, you really are fresh. Been ages since I saw an untampered prisoner." "Untampered?" I asked, but quickly regretted it. "Yeah, you know, a fresh one for them to reuse, modify, test, and dissect. Look at my leg," he said with a grin. "Hurt so much, but it's gone to the youngest model. Best leg they have seen, they said." "Hey, let him be," a soft voice said from further back. I strained my eyes and could just make out a grainy figure standing in the shadows on the other side of the room. I squinted, but could not quite make out their features, just tones of grey. "Shut up, old-timer! You're no good for anything," the man said. The grainy figure appeared to sob for a while, then sniffed and replied, "They will realize I'm useful one day, when you young ones all give up." Just then the door swung open, marked by the harrowing screams becoming louder as the ogre dragged someone in. It dumped the figure on the floor and stomped off back through the door. I glanced over at the woman, who was petrified, her eyes wide in fear. She had long hair, which flowed over two crudely grafted-on gigantic ears that hung down to her shoulders, and instead of legs, she had strange wheels attached to her body. As the door slammed shut, I heard more cries from the other end of the room and looked around, only to find that there were lots of figures, dotted here and there. I was half sickened and half curious, too petrified to stand still, so I trudged over through the swampy sands, arriving a dripping, sweaty mess. I slumped onto my knees, the sand sticking to my bare skin. Heaving to catch my breath, I waited till my cloudy vision cleared. "What can I do for you?" a woman screeched at me, opening her hands in a welcoming gesture. Her eyes were milky white, and her face set in a permanent grin, bright red lipstick crudely smudged around the approximation of her mouth. "What can I do for you?" she repeated, her blind gaze looking off past me towards the lofty ceiling, and her welcoming gesture repeated with thin, spindly arms. What can I do for you?" she repeated yet again, more intensely, her arms opening again in that odd gesture. "Could you tell me where we are?" I asked softly, so as not to startle her. Her head snapped forwards in my direction. "Happy to serve," she said, her permanent grin stretching even further to her ears. She abruptly stood and bowed. "I like your hair," she said briskly. "Thank you," I said. "Where are we?" "It's lovely weather today, isn't it?" she said brightly. I guess it is," I struggled to reply. "What can I do for you today?" she asked enthusiastically. Suddenly, there was an eruption of laughter from behind her. I looked that way to see a man bent over double, heaving in laughter, his manic cries echoing around the vast dungeon and mixing with the screams from above. "What's funny?" I asked gently. The man tried to gain some composure, looking up from his doubled-over pose. "Everything," he screamed. "Won't get no sense from her," he managed, pointing a shaking finger at the woman in front of me. The woman turned to the laughing man and bowed. "What can I do for you today?" which caused the hysteric man to grip his legs in massive, uncontrollable bouts of laughter. Then the woman slowly slid to the floor and blankly looked at the ceiling again. How can I?" she stuttered. How I like your hair. Lovely weather," she repeated again and again. I made my way over to the laughing man and suddenly took a double take when I saw the state of him. His left eye was missing, leaving a gaping hole, its dry flaps of skin healing. His left hand was missing all but one finger and was wrapped in an old bit of rag. "Please do," he said, noticing me. He held out his hand to cover his gaping mouth, trying desperately to gain some composure. A few trickles of blood fell from the wet bandage. "They took my fingers," he chuckled, "and my his bellows echoed, "my eye!" "That's terrible. Who did this to you?" I asked, my stomach churning at the thought. The masters, overseen by the chief," he managed to get out before rocking with laughs again. "We're all going to End our days here. Here, here. His eyes widened. Yes, we'll all get chopped up. Chopped up and tested on, he babbled between relentless screams of raucous laughter. Sickened, I looked away, frightened and horrified at the horrendous things that had been done to the broken people that surrounded me. Horrified at the thought it would only be a matter of time before it was my turn. I noticed another figure skulking in the corner, muttering something. Approaching her, she turned to face me. Her limbs and body seemed grey and nondescript. To my relief, she appeared to not have been cut up. "Hello," she said. "Hi, who are you?" I asked. "I am no one. Just one of the 183 wretches here." "But did you know that sand is usually made of silica, but this sand isn't?" "That's very interesting," I replied. "Do you happen to know where we are?" "Of course. You are standing—" She paused to calculate something. "You are standing precisely 1,042 millimeters, 30 degrees south of me. Together we are standing in a 30-meter long room entirely made of sand, like a receptacle." She started to explain. "Yes, but where exactly is it?" "It is situated exactly 15 meters below the testing center. Its ambient temperature is 28 degrees, and the current noise level is 105 decibels. Just then the screams from above went silent. "Correction, 12 decibels. And as if in response, the whimpers, laughter, and other rants of the prisoners increased to a crescendo. The door swung open, and the ogre brought what was left of the man he took earlier. He threw him into the sand and scanned the room for his next victim. I slunk down low, only to watch him grab at a woman on the other side of the room. The door slammed shut, and an ominous silence wrapped itself around the room for a moment, before the sounds of machinery, followed by screams, ringing out from above, erupted again. I sank to the floor, petrified of what torturous pain awaited me, what twisted, barbaric science. I found myself almost longing for the library again. At least I had been safe there. True, it had been under the dictating rule of Io, but I had been safe. I wondered where Felicia was, and more importantly, would I see her again? A thought that filled me with fear the more I let it dwell in my mind. So I pushed it to the back, telling myself she would come for me. I laid my head in my hands, then began to sob. I started to shake in fear as every scream punctuated what awaited me. Time became a blur till the screams above went silent again. I realized that strangely the silence seemed to be more worse than the screams, for it meant they were done with the woman they had taken and coming for the next, maybe me. The woman was brought back and another taken. I watched in dismay, tears streaming down my face. How could anyone ever do these things to others? I wanted to stand and fight, to free every single wretched being in here and to make those monsters doing the testing pay. But the sand sapped my strength, and I felt so very weak and powerless against such a vast and strong foe. I cried there, alone, till my tears ran dry and all that was left was the anxiety and churning sickness inside. So half delirious, I grasped my knees and rocked to and fro for comfort. More time slipped by, as it does even in the darkest and most terrifying places. It slips by. I caught snippets of the obscure conversations, bickering and sometimes informative conversations that went on around me, despite the screams from above. Then silence again. The door The stomping of the ogre, the screeching of another poor, poor person being taken. I rocked harder now. It seemed the only thing that would ease. The screaming that burrowed into my head, the anguish that racked my heart, and the fear churning inside me. Soon the blurs between the punctuating silent moments of abductions decreased, and time sped on. I watched so many come and go. Each time the door opened, I thought it would be me next, and each time my stomach churned. This went on and on, for what seemed like a lifetime. Days slipping into months, maybe even years passing, though I had no reference, no external light or clock, but on it relentlessly ticked, till eventually I lost track of everything. The only constant was the sand, that sand that seemed to drag me down. At first, I had thought that Felicia would find me and help me escape. That thought alone had kept me from truly falling to the darkness that was knocking at the doors of my mind. It had kept me standing and sitting, pacing ready. It had been the only thing that I had had to hold on to. But it was clear, after so very, very long of being here, she was not coming. Maybe she had forgotten me, or couldn't get to me. It was then I knew I was truly lost. In that moment, the sand took the last of me, and the creaking door in my mind crashed open. I lost all hope of escape, and everything felt pointless. So I lay there on the floor in the numb state, staring blankly at the walls, as despair began to rack my whole body and pull me into the very sand below. I let it, I welcomed it, for it was the inevitable. Down, down I fell, the jaws of the greedy sand consuming the last of me. But just as I let go of the last fragments of myself, the last shards of anything but this sandy place being my demise, suddenly, from nowhere, the image of Felicia came to mind. I held on to that smile, to those gentle eyes, to that brightness. My Felicia. She was my oasis, my only solace in the dark and twisted place I had found myself. The darkness receded, and I stood, my back resolutely straight, and decided that if they wanted to take me, if they wanted to cut me up, they would have to catch me. They would have to take me by force, and I wasn't going to come quietly. I would kick and scream and run and tear and bite to the bitter end. I would not give up. I clenched my fists and gritted my teeth as I looked around the room with a newfound determined defiance. I was Kentaro, and my last stand would be violently glorious. Either that, or somehow, I would escape and see my dear Felicia again. I didn't know how, but I had to. She was the fire that burned inside me. She was my reason to not give in to the sand. I would find her, or fight to the bitter end. I felt strong and tall in that moment. That was until the screams above went silent once again. The harrowing silence drifted on for what seemed like forever. Stomps of the heavy creature approached the other side of the door. Locks slid slowly, and the door rumbled open. The massive ogre stood at the top of the steps, eyeing the figures, its wide, bloodshot eyes glaring. I expected it to pass me by, but alas, its eyes fell on me, and to my utter horror, it smiled and took a step down the first of the flight of steps. It was coming my way, glaring constantly at me. I held Felicia's face in my mind, tensed my body, and was ready to make its job hard. I took a step back towards the wall behind me and reached down to pick up hands full of sand. I locked my sight on its overbearing red eyes and stood ready. Ready for my last stand. I would make it count. I would make it violent. I would fight to the bitter end. Just then, I noticed a psst coming from the wall behind me. I turned halfway round, keeping the ogre in my peripheral vision, the sand ready to blind its eyes. Psst! Quick! This way! A familiar voice said, daring to turn a little more. I saw a door open in the sandy wall and Felicia's bright eyes looking at me. Filled with hope and joy to see her, I rushed for the door and dove through. I felt the air move as it slammed shut behind me.